The night of June 30, 1916 passes slowly in the chalk trenches of northern France. Along a 25-mile front stretching from the village of Gomecourt south to the River Somme, more than 100,000 British soldiers wait in darkness. Some try to sleep, knowing rest may never come again. Others write final letters home, their handwriting cramped by the flickering light of candles. A few pray quietly. Most simply wait, listening to the distant rumble of artillery that has pounded German lines without pause for 7 days. At precisely 7:30 a.m. tomorrow morning, whistles will blow all along the line, and these men will climb ladders propped against trench walls and walk into history. What they don't yet know is that they're about to experience the single worst day in the entire history of the British Army, a catastrophe so complete and so shocking that more than a century later, July 1, 1916 remains synonymous with futile slaughter. By mid-1916, the Great War had ground into bloody stalemate. Along the Western Front, two enormous armies faced each other from elaborate trench systems stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Millions of men lived underground like moles, venturing above ground only to die in failed attacks that gained yards at the cost of thousands of lives. The year had begun with German forces launching a massive offensive at Verdun, deliberately designed to bleed France white through attrition. French commander Joseph Joffre desperately needed the British to relieve pressure on his embattled armies by launching their own offensive elsewhere. The location chosen was the Somme River Valley, selected primarily because it was where British and French forces met along the line, not because it offered any particular strategic advantage. Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, initially envisioned a joint Anglo-French operation. But the German attacks at Verdun had steadily drained French reserves, forcing Britain to assume the leading role in what would become the first major offensive mounted primarily by British forces. The responsibility fell to General Henry Rawlinson's Fourth Army, reinforced until it comprised 14 infantry divisions containing approximately 750,000 men. These weren't the professional soldiers of 1914, nearly all of whom lay dead in the cemeteries of Belgium. These were Kitchener's New Army, volunteers who had responded to recruitment posters in 1914 and 1915, trained through 1916, and now waited to prove themselves in their first major battle. Among these new formations were the Pals Battalions, units that represented perhaps the most poignant aspect of British military organization. Lord Kitchener had recognized that men would be more willing to enlist if they could serve alongside friends, neighbors, and workmates. The result was locally raised battalions drawn from specific towns, workplaces, or even sports clubs. The Accrington Pals came from the Lancashire mill town of Accrington. The Leeds Pals were raised from West Yorkshire. The Sheffield City Battalion recruited from Sheffield's factories and workshops. Grimsby raised the Grimsby Chums. Bradford formed two Pals Battalions. These units embodied the enthusiasm and idealism of 1914, when war seemed like an adventure to be shared with friends. By 1916, these amateur soldiers had been welded into effective infantry formations through months of training. They were ready. The question was whether their commanders had prepared them for what awaited. Haig's plan rested on a simple assumption: overwhelming artillery bombardment would destroy German defenses so thoroughly that infantry could simply walk across no man's land and occupy abandoned trenches. The preliminary bombardment began on June 24, 1916, initially scheduled to last 5 days, but extended to 7 when poor weather delayed the infantry assault. British artillery deployed along the front numbered approximately 1,500 guns, ranging from light 18-pounder field guns to massive howitzers. Over the course of 7 days, these guns fired more than 1.5 million shells, more ammunition than Britain had expended during the entire first year of war. The constant thunder could be heard in London, 165 miles away. Observers watched in awe as entire sections of German trench systems disappeared beneath clouds of smoke and flying earth. Officers assured their men that nothing could survive such bombardment. The wire would be cut, the dugouts would be destroyed, German artillery would be knocked out, the infantry would face only stunned, demoralized survivors easily overwhelmed. The reality was catastrophically different. British planners had made several critical miscalculations. First, Haig had expanded the original objectives, extending the attack northward and including the German second defensive line in the bombardment plan. This meant spreading the same number of guns over a much wider area. When calculated as shells per yard of German trench, the Somme bombardment was actually less intense than earlier battles like Neuve-Chapelle. Second, approximately two-thirds of the shells fired were shrapnel rounds, devastating against troops in the open, but largely useless against concrete-reinforced dugouts. Third, quality control at British munitions factories had proven appallingly inadequate. Estimates suggest that up to 30% of shells were duds that failed to explode, a failure rate that would haunt soldiers crossing no man's land. Fourth, the light field guns lacked the power and trajectory to destroy deep German dugouts, some of which extended 30 feet below ground. The German defenders had spent 2 years perfecting their defensive positions along the Somme. Their trench systems incorporated lessons learned from earlier battles, with multiple defensive lines, communication trenches, and most critically, deep concrete-reinforced dugouts immune to all but direct hits from the heaviest shells. These underground shelters featured multiple entrances, ventilation systems, and in some cases, electric lighting. Some could accommodate entire companies of soldiers. When the British bombardment began on June 24, German troops simply descended into these shelters and waited. They endured 7 days of continuous shellfire, emerging occasionally during lulls to repair damage and man observation posts, then retreating underground when the bombardment resumed. German machine gun crews knew their weapons were the key to stopping any infantry assault, and they protected their guns carefully, moving them into the deepest shelters during bombardment and preparing to rush them back to firing positions the moment the shelling ceased. British confidence remained unshaken despite warning signs. Reconnaissance patrols reported that German wire remained intact in many sectors, merely tangled rather than destroyed. Officers who ventured into no man's land during brief pauses in the bombardment returned with troubling reports of German trenches still clearly visible and apparently undamaged. But senior commanders dismissed these concerns. The plan called for the infantry to advance in successive waves across no man's land, maintaining formation and following a creeping barrage that would prevent Germans from manning their defenses. Some commanders, doubting whether inexperienced new army soldiers could execute complex tactics, ordered men to advance at a walk, maintaining rigid formations. Soldiers would carry heavy loads, rifles, bayonets, 170 rounds of ammunition, grenades, shovels, picks, wire cutters, sandbags, water bottles, and emergency rations. Some men bore burdens exceeding 60 pounds. They would advance slowly, deliberately, expecting to find only shattered trenches and defeated enemies. Dawn broke clear and warm on July 1, 1916. At 7:20 a.m., British engineers detonated the first of 17 massive mines planted beneath German positions. The largest, at Hawthorne Ridge near Beaumont Hamel, erupted 10 minutes early, creating a crater 130 feet across and 58 feet deep. The explosion served mainly to alert German troops that the assault was imminent. All along the front, German soldiers scrambled from their dugouts, racing to man their positions. Machine gun crews hauled their weapons up steep dugout stairs and positioned them at firing points carefully selected to create overlapping fields of fire across no man's land. Within minutes, hundreds of German machine guns were ready, their crews watching British trenches and waiting for the whistles to blow. At exactly 7:30 a.m., the British artillery bombardment lifted from the German front line and began moving deeper into German-held territory, following the planned creeping barrage. In British trenches, officers blew whistles and shouted orders. Soldiers began climbing ladders, emerging from underground darkness into bright summer sunlight. Along a front stretching more than 12 miles, thousands of men stepped out into no man's land and began walking toward the German trenches. For perhaps 30 seconds, an eerie quiet fell across portions of the battlefield. Then, the German machine guns opened fire. The slaughter was instantaneous and complete. German machine gunners, far from being stunned or demoralized, were fresh, alert, and positioned behind intact defenses. They had spent years training on their weapons and understood their business perfectly. The Maskenengewehr 8, the standard German machine gun, fired 500 rounds per minute and could sustain fire almost indefinitely with proper barrel changes and ammunition supply. Each gun could sweep back and forth across a defined sector, and German crews had carefully marked key points in no man's land with range markers. As British infantry emerged from their trenches, German gunners simply aimed at pre-sighted positions and pulled triggers. At ranges of 200 to 400 yards, every burst found targets. Men fell in groups, entire platoons cut down before advancing 20 yards. The carefully maintained formations that looked so impressive on parade grounds proved perfect targets for machine gunners who couldn't miss even if they tried. In the northern sector, opposite the villages of Beaumont-Hamel, Serres, and Gomecourt, the attack collapsed within minutes. The terrain here favored defenders, with German positions on high ground overlooking British assembly areas. As successive waves of British infantry climbed from their trenches, German gunners methodically destroyed each wave before it could cross no man's land. The 1st Newfoundland Regiment attacked at Beaumont-Hamel at 9:15 a.m., 4 hours after some other units, ordered forward in a futile attempt to exploit success that didn't exist. Of 801 men who went over the top, 324 were killed and 386 wounded within 30 minutes. The regiment effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Today, every July 1, Newfoundland observes Memorial Day commemorating this sacrifice. The Pals Battalions suffered devastation that would scar their home communities for generations. At Serres, the Leeds Pals were hit in their assembly trenches by German artillery fire even before 0 hour. When they finally advanced, German machine guns from 3 directions created an impenetrable wall of fire. Within 10 minutes, half the battalion was dead or wounded. Private Arthur Pearson, one of the survivors, later wrote words that became famous. The name of Serres and the date of 1st July is engraved deep in our hearts, along with the faces of our pals. We were 2 years in the making and 10 minutes in the destroying. The Leeds Pals suffered 24 officers and 504 men as casualties, with 15 officers and 233 men killed. They were accompanied by the Accrington Pals, who attacked the same sector. Of approximately 700 Accrington men who advanced, 235 were killed and 350 wounded within 20 minutes. The Sheffield City Battalion lost nearly 500 men. The Bradford Pals lost 1,770 out of 2,000 men in the first hour. The 10th Battalion West Yorkshire Regiment suffered such catastrophic losses that every man who survived the day later received a gallantry medal. Only 125 men were still standing when evening came. At La Baisselle, British forces detonated 2 enormous mines beneath German positions, creating the Lochniger crater that remains visible today. But the mines, like the preliminary bombardment, failed to suppress German defenses. The 34th Division attacked directly into a killing ground where German machine gunners had perfect fields of fire. The division suffered more than 6,000 casualties, the highest loss of any British division on July 1. At Thiepval, German positions built around a fortified chateau dominated the landscape. Wave after wave of British infantry advanced toward these positions and were cut down in windrows. The German defenders, far from being overwhelmed, fought with skill and determination, calling down their own artillery on British positions and launching localized counterattacks that drove back any units that managed to penetrate their lines. German defenders watched the carnage with varying emotions. Some felt horror at the mechanical slaughter, even as they continued firing. Others felt grim satisfaction at defeating an attack that had seemed so threatening. Machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed red-hot, pausing only to change barrels or reload. Artillery observers directed fire onto British assembly trenches, preventing reinforcements from reaching units that had gained any foothold in German positions. The German defensive system worked exactly as designed. Deep dugouts had protected defenders during the preliminary bombardment. Multiple defensive positions allowed troops to fall back to secondary lines if front trenches were lost. Telephone lines buried deep underground maintained communications between forward observers and artillery batteries. Ammunition supplies proved adequate despite the bombardment. The Germans had built a defensive system capable of defeating frontal assault, and on July 1 it passed its test with devastating efficiency. Yet the attack was not uniformly catastrophic. In the southern sector, where British forces joined French troops attacking south of the Somme, the assault achieved substantial success. The XIII Corps, attacking Montauban with the 18th and 30th Divisions, captured all objectives by mid-afternoon. Several factors contributed to this success. German defenses in this sector were less developed, with shallower trenches and fewer deep dugouts. The positions were visible from higher ground, held by British and French forces, allowing more effective artillery targeting. French heavy artillery supported the British right flank, and French accuracy proved superior to British bombardment. Most significantly, German artillery had largely been suppressed in this sector, and machine gun positions had been destroyed during the preliminary bombardment. The 18th and 30th Divisions advanced behind a well-executed creeping barrage, using more flexible tactics than divisions to the north. They captured Montauban and several adjacent villages, taking German prisoners and securing the only substantial British gains of the day. But these limited successes came at terrible cost and did nothing to offset the disaster further north. By late morning, British commanders realized something had gone catastrophically wrong. Reports flooding into headquarters told of entire battalions wiped out, of casualties lying in windows across no man's land, of German defenses completely intact. Haig, at his headquarters well behind the lines, initially received optimistic reports that bore little resemblance to reality. As the day progressed and more accurate information arrived, the scale of the catastrophe became undeniable. Yet the attacks continued. Throughout the afternoon, fresh battalions were ordered forward in futile attempts to exploit success that existed only in commanders' imaginations or to recover positions that had never been captured. Wounded men lay in no man's land throughout the day, many dying from wounds that might have been survivable with prompt treatment. Some lay there for days. The fortunate ones made it back to British lines during darkness. Others were captured by Germans who ventured into no man's land to collect their own wounded and found British soldiers still alive. As darkness fell on July 1, the butcher's bill began to be totaled. The final casualty count reached 57,470 British soldiers, of whom 19,240 had been killed. Another 35,493 were wounded, 2,152 were missing, and 585 had been captured. These figures represented casualties from a single day, sustained over the course of 12 hours, making July 1, 1916 the deadliest single day in British military history. To put these losses in perspective, British casualties on July 1 exceeded those suffered during the entire Crimean War, the Boer War, or the Korean War. They approached the total British combat deaths during the entire Falklands War. The casualties included 993 officers killed and another 1,337 wounded, a devastating blow to the Army's leadership. Some battalions had ceased to exist as effective fighting units. Others had been reduced to handfuls of survivors. The impact on British communities proved profound and lasting. The Pals Battalions concept, so successful at recruitment, revealed its fatal flaw. When a battalion drawn from a single town suffered catastrophic casualties, that entire community lost a generation of young men in a single day. In Accrington, the news that the Pals had been wiped out spread through the town like wildfire. Percy Holmes, brother of one of the Pals, remembered, "I remember when the news came through to Accrington that the Pals had been wiped out. There was hardly a street that hadn't lost somebody. It was a tragedy that struck the whole town." The Accrington Observer and Times initially printed optimistic accounts of success, but within days, its pages filled with photographs and names of the dead and wounded. Similar scenes played out across Britain. In Leeds, Sheffield, Bradford, and dozens of other communities, telegrams arrived announcing deaths and missing men. Churches held memorial services. Families displayed black wreaths. Entire neighborhoods mourned collectively. The strategic failure was equally complete. Haig had expected to achieve a breakthrough that would allow cavalry to exploit deep into German rear areas. Instead, British forces had gained perhaps a mile of ground in the southern sector and nothing whatsoever in the north. The villages of Sayre, Beaumont-Hamel, and Thiepval, primary objectives for the first day, remained firmly in German hands. They would not fall until months later, and Sayre would not be captured until February 1917, when German forces voluntarily withdrew to the Hindenburg Line. The artillery bombardment that was supposed to destroy German defenses had merely alerted them to the coming attack, giving them days to prepare. The infantry tactics that emphasized maintaining formation and advancing at a steady pace had sent men to their deaths with mechanical efficiency. The assumption that inexperienced soldiers needed simple, rigid tactics had proven disastrously wrong. German casualties on July 1 totaled between 10,000 and 12,000 men, serious losses, but a fraction of British casualties. The exchange rate was utterly unsustainable. At this rate, the British Army would be destroyed long before German defenses collapsed. German commanders recognized that they had won a tremendous defensive victory, though they also understood that British capabilities would improve and that the battle was far from over. Indeed, Haig ordered the offensive to continue, and the Battle of the Somme would rage until November 18, consuming hundreds of thousands more casualties on both sides. By the time winter forced an end to operations, British casualties totaled approximately 420,000, French losses exceeded 200,000, and German casualties ranged between 400,000 and 600,000, depending on how one counts. The battle achieved no strategic breakthrough, advanced the front line a maximum of 7 miles, and left both sides exhausted. The long-term implications of July 1, 1916 extended far beyond casualty statistics. The Pals Battalions were effectively disbanded as a concept. Surviving units received replacements from diverse sources, ending their local character. Military authorities recognized that concentrating men from single communities created unacceptable risks to morale and social cohesion when casualties struck. Future recruitment would distribute men more evenly across units. The British Army absorbed hard lessons about artillery tactics, infantry assault methods, and combined arms coordination. These lessons would eventually transform British military effectiveness, but they were learned at terrible cost. Culturally, the Somme left an indelible mark on British consciousness. The battle came to symbolize the futility and horror of the Great War. Poets like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, who served on the Western Front, gave voice to disillusionment with commanders who seemed callous about casualties and with civilians who failed to comprehend the war's reality. The war poets' work ensured that the Somme would be remembered not as a military operation, but as tragedy, as waste, as the destruction of a generation. The phrase, "lions led by donkeys," emerged to characterize British soldiers' courage contrasted with their commanders' apparent incompetence. While this characterization oversimplifies a complex military situation, it reflects genuine anger at a plan that sent men to their deaths with such terrible results. Today, the Somme battlefield is a landscape of memory. The Thiepval Memorial, designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens, commemorates more than 72,000 British and South African soldiers who died in the Somme battles and have no known grave. Their names are inscribed on the memorial's walls, a testament to sacrifice and loss. Smaller cemeteries dot the former battlefield, maintained by the Commonwealth War Grave Commission. The Lochnagar crater remains as a permanent memorial, its vast size speaking to the industrial scale of Great War destruction. Sheffield Memorial Park marks where the Pals Battalions attacked near Sayre. Every year on July 1, memorial services at Thiepval and other sites remember the fallen. Veterans of later wars attend, acknowledging debts to those who served before them. The ultimate question remains, was it worth it? Did the Battle of the Somme, and particularly its catastrophic first day, achieve anything that justified its cost? Historians debate this question still. Some argue that the Somme was necessary to relieve pressure on French forces at Verdun and that attritional warfare, however horrific, was the only viable strategy against an entrenched enemy. Others contend that better tactics, more realistic planning, and proper use of artillery could have achieved better results with fewer casualties. What seems undeniable is that July 1, 1916 represents a pivotal moment when British society confronted the true nature of modern industrial warfare and found it more terrible than anyone had imagined. The men who climbed from their trenches that July morning displayed courage beyond measure. They advanced knowing the odds were against them, maintaining discipline under impossible circumstances, continuing forward even as friends fell around them. Their sacrifice deserves remembrance not because it achieved military objectives, but because it revealed something essential about human nature under extreme duress. The Somme, and particularly its first day, stands as monument to courage, to sacrifice, to the terrible costs of war, and to the imperative of remembering why such costs must never be paid lightly. If this exploration of one of history's darkest days has given you new perspective on the Great War, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We're committed to telling these stories with the depth and respect they deserve, ensuring that sacrifices made more than a century ago are never forgotten. What other battles from the First World War should we examine? Let us know in the comments. Until next time, remember those who gave everything so that we might live in freedom.